Hello, everyone. How are you doing? My name is Travis Sawe. I am a research scientist at the Center for Gender and Sexual Health Equity, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you and introducing our speaker for today, Dr. John Oliffe. But first, I want to take a minute to reflect and acknowledge that we are meeting and hearing this talk today on unceded and ancestral Coast Salish territories, in particular the lands of the Musqueam and Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh people. I am a settler, an uninvited guest here, and am, as are many of us, learning how to be a good partner to Indigenous communities, and we're going to hear a really nice model of this today when John talks about the Dudes Club, which is remarkable for a number of reasons, but in particular in the ways in which it centers Coast Salish teachings as a way to engage with Indigenous men. I'm going to say just a few housekeeping items and then we'll get started. So we are live tweeting the event with the hashtag CGSHE Speaker Series in case any of you are also tweeters and want to tag us. You're welcome to do so. Our next speaker is on February 20th here. It's AJ Lowick, who will talk about trans people's experiences with sexual and reproductive health services in BC. If you haven't heard AJ speak before, you're really in for a treat, so come back and join us next month. And all of our speaker series monthly talks are listed at cgshe.ca/events. And so now I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. John Oliffe, who is a professor at the School of Nursing at University of British Columbia. As founder and lead investigator of UBC's Men's Health Research Program, his work focuses on masculinities as it influences men's health behaviors, including help-seeking and illness management, and its impact on partners, families, and overall life quality. Attracting more than $27 million in research funding and producing 300 publications, his research program has advanced significant insights to male depression and suicidality, psychosocial health, prostate cancer, smoking cessation, and amid contributing tailored community-based and e-health programs to augment traditional health services, which we'll hear a bit about today. And I would just add, I first met John probably going back 6 years, and shortly after that, through a colleague who was a postdoc of John, had a chance to work really closely with him. And what really impressed me and excited me was, you'll hear about the program of research that John was already running, but he really took the opportunity to adapt the existing research project to center experiences of queer and trans people, which is, I think, so important that we have these kinds of research coming not only from queer and trans communities, but also from larger research projects that are addressing the health issues that affect our communities. So with that, please join me in welcoming John, and we'll have time for Q&A after John's talk. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today and to share a little bit about the program. I guess a good starting point is to talk about deliverables. So I've got 11 deliverables in the next 40 minutes. And I'm going to talk about 2 myths around men's health. I'm going to talk about 3 I's. I'm going to talk about a sprinkle of theory, 4 lessons and caveats that we've learned from community-based programs, and close out with a men's health e-program or website that seems to be doing particularly well. So at a 35,000-foot view in men's health, I think there's 2 things that have driven the whole discourse around the need for men's health. Both of them are pretty raw and primitive in how they're put together. So admittedly, these numbers are old, but what's interesting to me about this is that we often say, let's do men's health because men don't live as long as women. So back in the 80s, the difference in life expectancy was 7.4 years, and right now, it's about 4 years. So it's closing, that gap is closing, we're all living longer. So aside from that not really being a rationale about why we should do men's health, it might actually be a moot point in the decades and centuries to come. I think what's far more interesting in the context of men's health is to think about where those differences might lie. And we know that in terms of life expectancy, it's about, and this is in order, cardiovascular disease, suicide, motor vehicle accidents, infectious diseases, most often HIV, and liver failure, most often secondary to alcohol overuse. So they're the things that actually account for that 4 years difference between men and women. It's interesting that as researchers, a lot of times what we tend to do is focus on one of those things. I think what's interesting is that those things often interconnect, those actual pieces. The other piece, I believe that every one of those issues is amenable to prevention, plus or minus effective self-care. And that's part of what we want to do within the domain of men's health. The other thing is that they're entirely gender relations. So by that I mean, even if you intersect or you intervene with men, there'll be flow-on differences to everybody in the man's life. Kids, women, other men. It's going to make a difference to everybody if you can intervene effectively. So again, oftentimes we get into this divisive space in men's health that is really unhelpful and also really naive for the issues that we're trying to address. The other thing is that we say that men don't go to doctors. This is one of my favourite ones from Huffington Post just last year, where they report out on 48% of the sample to say that blokes are too busy to go to the doctor and they're afraid of finding out something might be wrong. But you know, the fine print is that 52% of that sample said nothing would stop them from going to the doctor. So again, you know, the stories we tell oftentimes reify, you know, the prevailing knowledge and sort of push, I think they push messages out, especially to young fellas, about perhaps not going to the doctor. Perhaps that's the norm. And the normative, when it's not supported by the empirical base, is a lie. It's fake news and it's continually told. If you look at the real stats, you know, fair enough, there is a bit of we do lose guys to family care between 20 and 44. You know, we're represented in less numbers. But if you look at it when we get into the sixth decade and above and leading into the sixth decade, the numbers are very, very comparable. So just to say that men do have an association with healthcare, and I think it's really important to focus on that and to think about that rather than claiming sex differences as a way of doing the business of men's health. It's interesting also that men tend to rank their mental health higher than what women do. And then in terms of inequities, which neither of those first 2 points talk to when we aggregate men in terms of their life expectancy and also in terms of their help-seeking behaviours, you know, we find that, you know, with the First Nations peoples that they rank their mental health lower, and also by income. So pointing to these inequities which are often ignored or not really done very well in terms of the men's health space, you know, we tend to neglect them. So again, just trying to think about how we do inequities in men's health and trying to work with disadvantaged groups. And I've got a few examples of those sort of programs today that we've been part of over the years, and trying to maybe not build more resources, but trying to build tailored resources or gender transformative resources, which I'll talk to a little bit as well. Suicide in Canada is really interesting. It's much the same as other Commonwealth countries, including Australia. It's always much higher in men, about 3 times the rate. And when you disaggregate by age, you know, it sort of falls out the same way. So it's an interesting piece. And back in 2007, we became interested in what we believe was a discordant relationship. And that relationship was that men were diagnosed with depression at half the rate of women, and they suicide at 3 to 4 times the rate of women. Not suggesting that depression is the only route to suicide, but we were interested in what we claimed was a black box, trying to understand what the pathways were between depression and suicide amongst men, because we felt like it was a discordant relationship. So this black box, if we could just unpack that, if we could do that, we could get upstream, and we could also get downstream in terms of real prevention, upstream in terms of real mental health promotion that was tailored. So we got into some qualitative work. It was interesting. We recruited some guys to talk to us about depression, and we were inundated with university-age fellas, and many of them were international students, and they talked to us ad nauseum about things that they did to pass as not having depression, things like isolating, things like using substances, being with people but not really feeling attached, those sorts of things. And we wrote this little paper called Masculinities, and just to try and unpack some of the issues that were going on for the guys. It is interesting that over 30% of depressions, you know, are linked, over 30% of male suicides are linked to severe depression. So we did subsequent work in Photovoice, and it's a method that we've really liked, and I'll talk a little bit to it, and I'll actually invite you into some data in a moment around Photovoice, where we give people cameras and we ask them to take pictures to illustrate their experience of suicidality or their experience of depression. In this particular case, it was around their experience of suicidality. So we came up with three things: injury, interiority, and isolation as the three themes, drawing from 30-something interviews with young men, certainly young men in this case. So the first thing was injury. I think it's interesting. This guy is 21-year-old. He's experienced his parents divorcing, and neither of them expressing an interest in having him live with them. And he's then gone on to have a partner, and then that relationship has broken up. And he says, I think it's kind of what happened to me. For a while it just kind of feels like, yeah, you're useful, you're doing good, and then it's just eventually you might just end up being abandoned. You're going to be abandoned. So the picture is of a condemned flat or units, apartments, here that is playing the analogy. It's interesting with guys, a lot of times, they won't have talked about their injuries before, and so in the interviews they often find solace in being able to sort of talk to the things that have troubled them, and the idea that maybe sometimes things accumulate in a way to heighten the burden for a lot of these guys. Interiority is interesting too, because at a time when they've got injury, many of the men start to look inward for the remedy without the necessary resources or energy levels. A lot of them are battling fatigue to really overcome what's occurred for them. I really like this one from a 28-year-old South Asian fella who offers this padlock as an analogy. And just I'll read the last little bit there. If you don't know the combination, then you don't know how to get out of the depression and the suicide. But if you know the combination, you're able to unlock. And it's interesting that many of the guys who we spoke to were really searching inwardly to try and address their suicidality. Part of that is to control your emotions, and that is to suppress them. And then you get further away from those emotions. And the thing that we see most often with young men, and guys overall, is alcohol use or drug use as a way of blunting or a way of getting some respite. So the interiority is well intended, but at the same time, for a lot of men, it ends up actually exacerbating the injury. So the substance use, anger and risk-taking. So what we found with depression, and we believe is there, especially early on in men, is a type of externalising of symptoms which are anger, irritability, alcohol overuse, and risk-taking, things that we might not necessarily pick up on when we're using screening tools. So again, sort of having a look at that interiority. And isolation is the third one. And isolation is an interesting one. We oftentimes have this idea that it's the lonely guy in the corner that's not got any friends around them that's the isolated one. But in many of the guys who we spoke to, they're actually attached. They'd be working, they would have meaningful roles, but not be drawing any solace from those. They're actually struggling through those. And this is a really nice picture of a 26-year-old man who's coming home from work, and he just says, it feels like you're the only person on earth. It's a feeling that's so unbearable that you just want to get rid of that feeling forever. And so he's attached for all intents and purposes. He's got a job, he's got a place to live, got a car and he's driving home, but really quite isolated. And again, relating back to the interiority of the injury and working with that, and not seeking other help, or not effectively being able to cope with the injury as well. So we call it the Lone Ranger thing. The greatest sense of embarrassment is usually when and if the guys actually seek help. And the trouble is, of course, if you delay something that's not going to self-mend, then it tends to get worse, and the more intensive kind of treatments that are needed. So, and of course, there's the increased cost piece as well. So the recovery time is higher. If you're interested at all, the paper is detailed in an 8,000-word, lazy little read there, but it's actually, it does a nice job of unpacking it. We're not the only people to do theories, and I'll talk to the Joiner piece in a moment. There's lots of theories around around suicidality, and that was our contribution to that. It's interesting, the photographic work, I really like the method. I'm a big fan of image-based methods, especially for issues of depression, suicidality, because I think that they help us express what's going on the inside, and I think it's a particularly good method for that. So just that's one of 3 that I've led, but we've had a really great team of writers. Jen Creighton, who's with Michael Smith now, did a great job as a postdoc of unpacking some papers. So we did women's experiences of losing a man to suicide, and we did queer women's experiences of suicidality, and she's written from those using exactly the same method as I've shared with you in the other article. And another terrific assistant prof now in Montreal, Olivia Phil, the postdoc with me, and he did gay men with suicidality with the same method, and also gay men who had HIV, and really, really solid work, terrific work coming out from those. So there's been a team of writers. There's 132 of these interviews, and we're just, there's a dozen papers there. This one's currently in review. I didn't know it was being recorded today, so I probably would have redacted this, but I'm going to go with it anyway. I submitted this paper, and this is not a beef, but I submitted this paper, and it was about men losing a male to suicide, and it was asking these guys to talk about the deceased's help seeking. And it was in review for 12 months with a highly, highly prestigious journal. And so 12 months I wait, I get 2 reviews back. One of the reviews is no changes, happy with it. And the other review is, I think you need to do culture rather than masculinities within the paper. So I thread in culture to the masculinities piece, because culture done well does include masculinities. I resubmit it, and these are the 3 key points by which the paper was rejected based on those revisions. So he suggests that one of the reasons that it should be rejected is because after 12 months your memory of suicide and the person's help seeking by extension is not valid. The other piece is that we had a very diverse sample in terms of sexual identity, in terms of ancestry, and he said that, well, the guys from China, India and Hong Kong would have had a very different experience, so they should be taken out of the sample. And my favourite one, at the end, he goes on to say that we better exclude the Indigenous fellows as well because they don't fit with the cultural piece. It was an N of 20 in the study. So other than clearly being bruised by the experience myself, I share this to say, when you review papers, I think we have an obligation and grants to actually review what's on the page rather than redesign the study. That's one of the things. But also we talk about inequities all the time. And so inequities shouldn't be divisive. Like, he's asking for an homogenised sample, and we've purposely been diverse in trying to say what prevails with the context of the inequalities that occur for people within that sample. So just to say, I will get past this anyway. I'll move on. Clearly, I'm not quite there yet. But thank you for the debrief. I feel much better, even if you don't. Anyway, the Joiner article I think is interesting too. If we talk about theory in terms of the 3 I's, the injury, inferiority, and isolation, I still really like Joiner's work, because in our populations where we're doing gay men and gay men who had HIV and queer women, 2 of the things that continually popped up were around burdensomeness and thwarted belongingness. And so that marginalisation that comes with some of those positionalities within those identities. So again, I'm not suggesting that what we've come up with is better. I just think the Joiner piece is really nice to sort of refer back to, and we might be renaming some things, but I do like the way he's put this together, and we often refer to it, just to say. I'd like to invite you into some of the photographs of the 132 interviews that we did. And what we've done is just put them together in a little video. The images there and the accompanying narrative from the participant is there as well. And these are from men who've experienced suicidality, and I'm just inviting you into a bit of a Q&A to say, you know, what is it that you see within these images as well? What did you see? Is there an I that I may have missed? Injury, interiority, isolation? Doesn't have to be an I word. Just looking for new paper ideas here. You can help me. What did you see? What struck you about the images? Okay, so there is some hope, isn't there, in them? Yep. And we haven't written that piece yet? Yep. Other things?
I think it's about that personal perception too. What you said earlier about risky behaviors, for example, I never really out of that, but to me that's like a slow suicide.
Yeah.
They're not, the person may not actually be thinking about suicide in the traditional sense, but behaviors are,
Yeah.
are there.
Yeah, like an ambivalence for living. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so some of these aren't necessarily about what we might even perceive as risk, but more in inflection. Yeah. Any others? I've got 2 new papers. People often ask about the music. The music was contributed by a man who lost his daughter to suicide, recognising that those photographs and those narratives he was playing a soundtrack to. So it's quite, to me, it's a kind of juxtaposition because the music's kind of a little up. I would have expected something a bit more sombre, but it's kind of interesting, but I really like it. I'm glad to be able to share that with you. As a method, I think it is really helpful for bringing people into a conversation that they might not ordinarily have. So when we showed those ones in photographic exhibitions, kind of in real space, not virtually, it really did open up conversations. I think it was really powerful in a lot of those events, I think. So what do we know about services? We know that oftentimes when we're looking at depression, we use the PHQ-9. It's got 9 items. One of them is related to suicidality. As I mentioned, the idea that men arrive aggressive with irritability, alcohol overuse and risk-taking is kind of important, and the work of Simon Rice out of Melbourne University in the men's depression risk scale I think is really taking off in terms of having been validated in Australian samples and in Canadian samples to show that this can be a really helpful guide for highlighting the potential for depression risk in men, so I think that's worked really well. Jennifer Wide, who's a psychiatrist here, done some great work too, and this is such a neat study. She interviewed guys who were in the waiting room waiting to see their GP and did all these measures on them, one of which was related to suicidality, and amongst those 7 showed positive for suicidal intent. They go into the doctor's room, they see the doctor, and they come out, and then we audit the chart, and then the chart, shows what the issue was for the man. And none of those 7, despite having suicide intent in the waiting room, mentioned anything to the doctor, or perhaps there wasn't anything solicited, but there's a breakdown in terms of that help seeking, and I think it really troubles us in terms of thinking about, well, when we say men don't seek help, well, they actually may, and they may not actually be finding the help or connecting. And that gives us the work of Zach Seidler and Paul Links, but just to say, up to 60% of men who suicide have accessed professional health care in the 12 months prior to their death. And so we're really trying to unpack some of those issues. So Zach Seidler's out of Melbourne, and he's doing some work in better understanding what it takes to keep men in a therapeutic arrangement with a bunch of different treatment modalities. And Paul Links is out of Toronto, and he's doing some really nice work, and it's interviewing and working with GPs who have lost a patient to suicide to better understand what they think might have contributed to, that outcome from their perspective. So again, trying to better understand healthcare services. Because we know that a lot of times if we can trade on the things that men do well or the values that they have, or some people would say the masculine ideals or norms, then absolutely, we know that we can get better outcomes. And it's not to reify these positions for guys, but it is to work with the strength-based piece. So there's more details on that one in the article there that, again, is a longer read, but it certainly gets into those 2 pieces around depression and suicidality that I mentioned. So this is the sprinkle of theory. We use social constructions of masculinities. So the idea that you learn about masculinities in all different ways, and you present differently depending on the context in which you're in. So at work you might present in one way, at home you might present in another, depending on the milieu in which you're in. And so it comes from the work of Connell, and Connell had this idea that there was a dominant norm and that people aspire or don't align to it in different ways, different configurations of practice. So theory is interesting, it helps us unpack it. People often ask, well, is gender actually the outcome? Like, are we trying to transform gender? Is that what we need to do to arrest the suicide rates in men? And in part, it may well be part of the question, but it's the theory that drives that kind of the analysis that we do. Socialisation theory is slightly different because it assumes to know the items that men value, and then it asks them to rank themselves in terms of their agreeance with particular statements which are masculine norms. And it comes from the South, and it kind of trades on some ideas about, what those masculine norms are. Naively, we produced a paper that was trying to say what we want to do is talk about men's values, because I'm kind of tired of the masculine ideals and the masculine norms. I think it's time we talked about what do they value and then work with those values to try and help them be the best they can be, as Pollyanna as that might sound. So we did this study on young fellas, 15 to 29, out of the west of Canada, and we asked them, what do they value? What do you value as a man? And so we did it as qualitative, and then we tested the items in a quantitative measure, so 600 strong. And so they came up with selflessness, openness and well-being. And I thought, well, that's really good. Perhaps we've got a generational shift here. Perhaps we've got some changes that we need to document. The press loved it. Like, they jumped on it all over. They're all like, oh, millennial men are great, altruistic, this is terrific, this is a sea change and everything like that. But back in the academy, in December, someone's written a piece that said, look, sorry, statistically what you did wasn't valid, so let's not go with that. We're going to keep working with the idea of values, because I think sometimes what we do is we get kind of attached to theory and we stop thinking about theory. The theory just helps us think about the data, and we're so familiar with it that it stops us sort of advancing it. So again, just trying to work through that. This is a picture of a lady who lost her son to suicide, and I think it's always a great reminder too, in terms of the theory. Connell had always wanted us to do gender relations. She had always said, hey, this is about how people are with other people. So it's not, a norm that impacts you and you embody for the rest of your life. It's much more contextual and nuanced than that. And I think this is a great reminder that it is relational. I think the other piece that comes out of the WHO is we've talked about this idea that what we produce as remedy should be gender sensitive, gender specific, but most of all gender transformative. The idea that we transform some of these practices that aren't helping guys, and I would say by extension not helping other people around those guys, to try and make some changes that are going to be beneficial in terms of working with the resources that we have. The other piece is sex and gender. So I talk about gender as a construction, and then sex as the biology, and we know there's a whole bunch of work in sex and sex differences that talks to the biology, some of which is deeply implicated in men's suicidality. So, there's a whole piece of literature around, raised testosterone levels, increasing aggression, and low testosterone levels, increasing depression. So again, trying to cobble those two things together so as they're not talking in silos, because oftentimes our results are starkly similar, and so it would be great to be able to integrate more. 4 caveats from the great work that happens across Canada in terms of community-based programs. So I'm not saying don't go to services that are professional services. I'm not saying let's just keep pushing men into those services. I'm saying let's not replace them with these, but let's try and work out ways to integrate people into the systems that we do have. So men's sheds is one. It works in Australia because the government pour a ton of money into it, and there's sheds everywhere and people go to them, and it's guys usually that are going through transitions such as retirement, divorce, those sorts of things, and they'll go into these volunteer spaces and be with other men to do and work on particular items. It might be woodwork, it might be gardening, whole myriad of things, cooking. And so this whole premise is that these sheds are now popping up in Canada. So we're probably 10 or 12 sheds across Canada that are popping up, and men are going to these sheds. And the whole construct is that men connect by doing. So you reduce their social isolation, because if you're doing something and you're shoulder to shoulder, then it reduces the pressure to talk. And the caveat that we propose for this is that absolutely, that's great, you bring them in because they've got a purpose and it gives them routine, But men also also connect by talking and through silences. And so we've really encouraged programs like Men's Sheds to think about pacing the work that they do, so there is room for guys to interact with each other, because it does occur often in the informal kind of spaces. So if you get them too busy, then you can sort of quash some of that natural occurring piece. The other piece is, you know, within these places, a lot of times the community-based ones are interesting because they really do, they trade on the notion that you have the permission and affirmation of other men to shift the norm. So if men don't talk, and that's the norm, and you bring them into a space where they are talking, the obligation is to keep those norms shifted. So you're creating a milieu that's different. And it can only happen with the permission and the affirmation of all the men there. So again, prostate cancer support groups across Canada, they're 100 strong, and what they do is they bring people into a conversation they would not ordinarily have about erectile dysfunction, incontinence, death, you know, breakdown of relationships in the context of prostate cancer. And so oftentimes the leaders of those groups will come to me and they'll say, but John, folks aren't showing up, we're not getting big numbers. And I say, well, that's okay. If someone comes and gets what they need from one group meeting and they leave, then you've done a really good job, you know, notwithstanding the leadership succession issues. And so just to say that reliance on masculine stereotypes can explain the attrition that happens in community-based programs as well, but you've got to hold form for the norms that you've created, and that's my advice to the support groups that we work with. The other piece is, you know, men's perceived low literacy, heightened stigma. The biggest barrier, I believe, one of the biggest barriers at least, is this idea that men don't have the language, and so a lot of times we focus on trying to give them the language. So these couple of studies, we found that the highest levels of stigma are amongst guys who'd experienced suicidality, and that was self-stigma about getting help. So they were more embarrassed than most other folks about getting help. So again, you know, this trying to get their literacy up around, you know, norming the help-seeking piece. And so, you know, just knowing and working with men's language. So that we run the Veterans Transition Program out of UBC. It's the first veterans-friendly campus in Canada. We're bringing people back from war and integrating them into education. And they run this program out of counselling psychology, and it's group-based. And so they'll bring the guys in, and they talk about unpacking your baggage, and they talk about release. And then when they recruit, unethically probably, they bring people in by saying, you haven't got a problem, but the guys at the group could really do with a hand. And so you're coming in, you're appealing to their sense of camaraderie to come in and help other guys. And that to me is literacy. You know, it's not about teaching the biomedical literacy so much as working with the language that those guys know and that they have and work with. Dudes Club, as Travis mentioned at the front end, such a great success story. We talk about sustaining and scaling community-based projects and programs, and it's hard work. It's really hard work. And Paul Gross has done an amazing job with this. Started in the downtown east side, fortnightly drop-in for Indigenous fellas and non-Indigenous fellas who are challenged by things such as homelessness, substance use, bring them into a space where they can get a haircut and a feed, and actually talk and connect in ways to unpack some of the health challenges that are going on for them. But it's connected to a clinic within the space of a clinic, I think is really interesting, and such an interesting, you know, permeation of healthcare. And it's been such a solid kind of model, and it's extended to 15 or 20 spots, I think it is now, in terms of across BC, and I think it may have led into Alberta as well. So they've done a really nice job of creating these spaces within the community that are familiar to men. So I think it's really helpful. I'm closing out here, so just to say e-health as well, I think is interesting. This one out of UBC Psychiatry that we're involved in with funding from November. We attracted 1.5 million. We get about 60,000 visitors per month to this site. I think it works because the language is plain. It is directed as a depression resource for men, by men, and it's heavy on the video in terms of ideas that people have about challenges and strategies, but also professional healthcare providers offering some advice. But it's all about self-management ultimately. So the biggest traffic that we get to this is about self-checks, and we also get a lot of things around self-management. So again, it's obviously filling a void in terms of people wanting to access, an evaluation of themselves where we use the PHQ-9 and we run a few items from Simon's survey questionnaire as well, and also, just trying to find ways to self-manage effectively. Much of our traffic comes from the States, but the Commonwealth is pretty well represented there as well. And interestingly, we get 150 visits a day with organic searches that suggest suicidal intent, and we more recently get 35 visits a day, which are inquiries about marijuana use and depression. So again, this part of the world in the legalisation is probably, fueling some of those things. So it is interesting for what people go there for. I just close out with going a circle back to the black box. I think about the black box still all the time, and it's kind of what drives a lot of our work, thinking about how to better unpack some of the issues. Funny enough, I didn't know the black box was orange, and it does actually make sense because I figure it would be easier to find, but I actually didn't know that. I don't care much for baseball at all, but I do love Moneyball. I think Brad's pretty good too, but I actually think that Moneyball is one of the best movies ever, and I love this line in it: if we weren't already doing it this way, is this how we would do it? And it's just to say that, when you're in it long enough and you keep working through it, I think we've got to ask ourselves time and time again to reinvent how we're looking at a certain problem. So I'd like to think that all of our discovery and our intent on finding nuances prevails, rather than getting caught in the things that we already know or think we know, and to continue to ask questions, to try and unpack this, because this is a very multi-dimensional issue that I think is going to require lots of good ideas to really make a dent on this suicide rate. We have a Twitter handle, and it'd be great if you followed us. And we have all of our articles on the website. They're all kind of archived there. So if there's anything that piqued your interest, by all means, they're all available. So feel free to download any of those. Thank you.